brought you on because I wanted to have a somewhat
Mhm.
casual, informal conversation about what has brought us here. Why is there so much division, particularly on the left, about this region? And what exactly is the path forward for what we're going to see? First, I would like our good friend Jean Bajlan to give a history for those who are not initiated. Can you explain to us who were the Assad regime? Bashar, who was the son of Hafiz al-Assad. How did the Assads come to power? What do they represent? What faction of Arab political history do they represent? And exactly how did it become a force in the Republic of Syria?
Yeah, okay. So Baathism was a kind of, a form of pan-Arab nationalism that, drew on sort of socialist traditions, but also fascistic traditions as well. Many of its intellectual founders were Christians. Michel Aflaq, for example, was one important figure, and so this was a strand within the kind of pan-Arab movement that emerges in the kind of moment of decolonization. Now, in terms of the Ba'ath Party's rise to power, we see the Ba'ath Party rising to power in both Iraq and in Syria in the early 1960s. Within the context of Syria, the Ba'ath Party sort of come to power in the early 1960s in reaction to the failed project, the United Arab Republic, which had been initiated by Nasser, and the Egyptians had brought Syria and Egypt into a kind of single country. There was a coup against the kind of Nasserist faction. Many people in Syria felt that Syrians were kind of playing second fiddle to the Egyptians, and the kind of pan-Arab project that Nasser was pushing forward was more of a kind of covert Egyptian imperialism. Anyway, so we have the Baathists come to power, and then following the debacles of the wars with Israel in the late 1960s, we see Hafez al-Assad coming to power in a kind of in a coup. So another faction, if you like, of the Ba'ath Party coming to power. Now, then, of course, the Ba'ath Party in Syria ended up coming into conflict with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, but they kind of represented a secular nationalist strand within pan-Arab nationalism, and yeah, basically that's how I would put it. And very often, the Baathism, both in Iraq and Syria, came to be a cover for the rule of particular sectarian minorities. So obviously, we have in Syria Baathism serving as a cover for the domination of the Assad family and their supporters within the Alawite community. Although the Alawite community were not all on board with Baathism. I think that's important to point out. Similar to the way in Iraq that Baathism became a kind of cover for Sunni domination in a majority Shia country. So this is a kind of secular nationalist project that emerges in the decolonial but begins to basically decline from its inception. And these regimes, although proclaiming a kind of universal pan-Arabism, were often undergirded by a de facto kind of sectarian politics, even if it wasn't necessarily expressed so clearly in that way.
Particularly, yes, in the case of the Assad regime, they were Alawites, as you stated, which was a rather despised and often persecuted regime in Syria, if I'm not mistaken, going back many, many years. With some people, one of the sayings in the Muslim world about the Alawites is that some people don't even consider them Muslims. And as a matter of fact, that they were so, quote unquote, deviated from the normal practices. I'm sure you would know more about that than I would, Gene, in terms of the.
Well, I mean, we can think about them as a kind of heterodox Islamic sect, that a Shia-leaning heterodox Islamic sect. I would definitely call them Muslims, but of course, many Sunni Muslims may have different opinions on that. As we know, often within religious communities, there are kind of big divisions over who is and who is not part of that community. But of course, Alawites would probably define themselves as Muslims, even though their belief systems and practices are perhaps different from the Sunni majority that exists in Syria.
What was the main reason that the Assad regime for so many years was being supported by the Russians or the former Soviet Union?
I mean, in terms of the...
why don't we move that to Cuba? Cuba, do you want to answer that question?
Certainly, I can chime in. The one final dimension I would emphasize about the Ba'athist regime in Syria was that it claimed to be a socialist, revolutionary, anti-imperial movement. And as a result, it attracted a lot of sympathy from Western leftists, pan-Arabists, international revolutionary types, especially since it had a consistent record in supporting anti-American, anti-Western forces, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria was not a party to any of the Israeli peace agreements in the region, unlike Jordan and Egypt, which were considered to be more leaning towards the Americans during the Cold War period. Syria's isolation, unwillingness to collaborate with Western governments, the hostile relationship that it had with the UK, with France, with the United States, made it a relatively natural fit for a Soviet ally in the region, especially after the relative alienation of Iraq during the Saddam period. So in return, the Syrians received an area for operations and intelligence gathering in the Middle East, as well as some basing and military infrastructure that allowed them to project power. That relationship, of course, ends with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but because of continuities on both within the Syrian Ba'athist regime, which same people, same institutions, and the sort of Putinite connections to the intelligence agencies through the from the FSB back to the KGB and Soviet military intelligence, their predecessors, it was easy to restart that relationship, especially since the underlying geopolitical arrangements hadn't really shifted. Syria remained isolated from the West, from American-led globalization, despite the fact that it was a Gulf War, relatively speaking, ally against Iraq, both in the first and second American wars. And it became, that relationship was revived. And until the fall of the Assad regime, one of its biggest sponsors, backers, international allies, arms suppliers, intelligence partners, you name it, was the Russian Federation. The other being Iran.
So as you state, there was a geostrategic relationship between Russia and the Soviet Union and the Assad regime going back to the Cold War that basically, for continuity purposes, continued up until after the Cold War, that facilitated, because of Russia's kind of outlier position in the world, a more natural support. Now,